our relationship was a total of 12 years. We were together for 2 years before we got married, and we were married for 10 years.
I was married for 26 years and we were living together for 28.
The relationship was turbulent the whole time. It wasn't the fact that it was one massive big ending. It was a lot of difficulties along the way.
And there's grief too. There's grief that what you started out to do, which was to be with each other till the end of days, hasn't worked out. And grief that you're going to be splitting up a beautiful family.
Everyone else I knew that was separating or had been through the legal system had got separate lawyers and fought through the court systems, and some of them even moved away. And so the whole family unit was completely torn apart.
We've seen a number of people lose a lot of money going through that system, and they've ended resentful of their ex-partner because it ended up being a situation where two parties were just fighting and fighting and fighting.
My parents split up when I was 6, and my mum left the family home with my brother and I for someone else. Then the battle ensued, and in 1979, which is 4 years later, my stepfather took my brother and I overseas, and we didn't see our father for a decade. So that painful experience for us really shaped the way I wanted to handle my separation, divorce, and also the childhood I wanted my children to still have.
What we know is it's not the actual separation per se that's going to do the most damage to children. Children cope with the separation. If the parents cope and manage it well, children can cope well, and there's no discernible difference in their outcomes. It's the conflict.
So children who do worse than any other group are those children whose parents share their care, and that is, have children who live predominantly equal time or something approximating equal time, but maintain high levels of conflict and involve their children in that conflict. Those kids are at significantly higher risk of having not only immediate problems with behavioural difficulties, acting in or acting out, problems with concentration and behavioural difficulties, but in the longer term are at a much higher risk of having problems with anxiety and depression, alcohol and substance abuse, and difficulty sustaining intimate relationships.
Some children cannot concentrate at school. They just sit there and they're physically present, but psychologically, emotionally, they're not there. They're wondering if mum's okay at home. She was crying all day. Or, if there's going to be a fight between mum and dad, and they need to be there to look after somebody.
Some of the children I see will tell me that I say different things to my mum and dad because I know that's how they feel. Other children will try and editorialise. They try and change the message so as to not upset their mum or dad. Some children just become very stressed and can't manage and become highly symptomatic as they live in this cauldron of discord. And other children split one parent off and say, look, it's just too hard to live in this state of dissonance. I'm going to split that parent off and reject that parent and reside only with one, so I'm living in one coherent world. None of that is healthy in terms of long-term psychological functioning, not the least of which is that those parents are providing an extraordinarily poor model of how to deal with conflict and how to deal with relationships.
Sadly, the children often know a lot more than the parents think they know. I commonly see parents who say, look, we did fight, but never in front of the children. And I then interview the children and they're shocked at how much the children know.
One little boy said to me, I can hear how my parents really feel through my eyes, which was a remarkable thing because he was so attuned to what was going on. He was constantly looking to try and read what was going on instead of just being able to focus on himself and his own development and age and stage appropriate things.
What the child knows is it's because of them that mum and dad are fighting. And that puts enormous guilt onto the child. They feel responsible because they're egocentric when they're young. So everything rotates around them and they feel responsible.
And when, as an adolescent, you're exposed to high levels of stress and anxiety and suffer from depression, lowered mood and other psychological problems, you are therefore, by implication, at higher risk of having those problems across the course of your life. So really we're talking about a mental health crisis. If you look at the implications in terms of the psychological functioning of children whose parents separate as a single mental health issue, then that's probably one of the greatest considerations for us today in terms of future societal norms and expectations.
I think at the time people separate, or they might have separated for a period of time, but things are now going badly for whatever reason. It's around the most vulnerable times of people's lives, the most difficult times in people's lives. And they're highly emotional, they're very vulnerable, they often angry and disaffected, unable to think clearly around all the issues. So they look for powerful other entities and people to help them in their dispute.
As a family lawyer, I am often the first point of contact, although frequently people might have seen a GP or they might have seen a psychologist. But in terms of accessing the system, which they think is going to deliver them outcomes about parenting arrangements and money and property, yes, we will often be the first person that people will come to see.
A lawyer is only as good as their instructions. So they can only work on the basis of the story that they've been told. And the trouble is that most people become fixated on certain parts of their story and other parts of it just fall off.
The adversarial system is about putting two narratives, one of which, or parts of one of which are wrong and one is which is right. And that's all the judge has. And us as practitioners too. That's what we're trained to look at, those two sides of that story. There's a lot more between those two sides of the story.
What happens is you see that people have such different points of view. They see the world from such different perspectives, and the affidavit material very rarely says anything positive. It tends to focus on the negative.
I had a gentleman sit in my office once when I was in the court, and he had papers in his hand. He said, "I've read these documents every day for a year." Every day for a year he'd read about what she'd said about him.
And people immediately are feeling on the back foot and are having to defend their position and defend their decision by retaliating with a counter position, so that sense of split and division becomes greater and greater and greater as the process proceeds.
The point of litigation is to drive the narratives further apart. It's like you put people in the opposite corner of the boxing ring and you say, do everything you can to separate and distinguish your argument and your story from the other person's. That's really where we need to start. We may need to concede that there's some common ground or some arguments that we're not going to win, but we're actually there to drive the narratives apart. That is the job of an adversarial lawyer.
What happens with separation and divorce is that it's the dissolution of a legal contract, but it's not the dissolution of the family.
Families should be encouraged to try to keep the power to make their own decisions within their family. And only if that's not possible, then resort to the court. But not all lawyers have that same approach. Some lawyers think, oh no, my role is as a lawyer. I've been approached as a lawyer. I'll do the legal thing and I'll start down that adversarial process.
I think an adversarial mindset can start to play out in a relationship enormously quickly, and that will be hastened by each person going off and getting separate legal advice, because instead of being told, here's the prospects of how you can resolve this, they're told, here are the prospects of how you can win an argument. So I think it's 0 to 100 pretty fast.
The more money you invest and the longer you invest yourself and your time, then the less willing you are to compromise. So someone who might have compromised at the beginning isn't going to compromise at the end. And unfortunately, we see things showing that all the time. And I picked up the paper the other day and there was some reports of people who'd given their stories to the Australian Law Reform Commission in relation to their report, saying, you know, I settled this case after 3 years for less than I offered in the first 6 months. And that's what happens, and that's really regrettable. And of course, the amount of money people spend with lawyers then, in property settlement particularly, makes it more difficult for them to settle because the stakes are higher.
Court clearly has an important role to play when there are allegations of abuse when there are serious mental health issues, when there are severe drug and alcohol problems. It's as though the court adopts a position of super parent, a higher authority making decisions, and especially when there are important determinations of fact. For some cases, the facts are critically important.
A colleague of mine describes two different processes, and I quite like the wording he uses. So he talks about forensic cases and non-forensic cases. And the non-forensic cases are those where the outcome doesn't really depend necessarily on a finding of fact. They're the cases you should be able to settle, even if they're in the court system, because they usually depend upon an exercise of discretion. Where you've got what he calls forensic cases, they're cases where the outcome will depend upon fact-finding, and you absolutely need a judge to do that.
I think for the majority of families, the court is an overkill. It's not that necessary. But for some families and some circumstances, it's absolutely necessary.
Once you're in the court system and once you're going to a trial, you lose control. You lose control of what happens along the way, and you lose control of the outcome, clearly, because the judge is going to make a decision that's not yours any longer. So settlement is, if it's possible to achieve, the best outcome. Now, not every case can be settled, but those that can should, in my view.
I think that if we're able to invite people to consider other options, that there are other ways, then better outcomes can be achieved.
Mediation became mandatory with the 2006 reforms. And again, that was designed to keep people out of court.
What I discovered in mediation is that the big difference is you deal with both stories in the room at the same time. Now, that has its incredible challenges, because if they're very different and they don't have an overlap, then you've got to work with that. But by one party hearing the story of the other, taking the time to appreciate that there are different perspectives and that there are different takes on this, and maybe one's not right and one's not wrong, but they both perhaps can live side by side, and you can then look at maybe there's a bit of a narrative in the middle that you can develop.
You're supposed to have to make a bona fide attempt to resolve things, but of course some people don't. But it does require that people, unless you're one of the exceptions, have mediation, and the mediators then have to just give a certificate as to whether the mediation has been successful or failed.
So if you can, at the very beginning, give parties an opportunity to listen to each other and to hear each other, which sometimes is very hard, but if you can facilitate that, then that, for me, was a big change. And that's what I think was the crossroads for me. It changed my whole approach, and it meant that I was then searching for something different.
What I would say about mediation training is that it changed my life. It changed the way I looked at people, relationships and litigation, and it was probably the start for me of leaving the mainstream litigation system.
My own marriage broke down in 2005. We had 3 small children, aged 8, 6 and under 2. And I guess my ex-husband and I, it's part of who we were as people, but as parents, we didn't want the conflict.
I went through a separation as well, and my legal training did not help me. I say my lawyer brain started telling me all sorts of stories. And even though I had a legal settlement, which I thought was okay, I wasn't willing to accept that mentally. So I really had to do a lot of work on myself. And that's when I discovered divorce coaching, and I decided to upskill and retrain. And I more or less coached myself through my own divorce. And having gone through that, I really don't know how people are able to do it without a coach.
I decided to retire from the court after 21 years. I felt it had been long enough in that system. And at the time when I left, I just felt there had to be a better way.
I wanted to return to law as a helping profession. So looking at alternative dispute resolution and designing a system where I was working with non-lawyers seem to me to fit all of those things.
I saw that there was a real need for families to have all these services and to have them in an integrated way, to have services that would help them heal and be able to move on in a more positive way than they were currently experiencing.
It is really desirable for people, if they can, to resolve their disputes certainly without having a hearing. And they can do that with all the different forms of mediation. And I mean, I see new forms of mediation or alternative dispute resolution in its broadest sense being a really good thing. And the more innovative forms of that we can find to come up with, the better, in my view.
I guess I knew enough about the judicial system to know that it was basically client and lawyer pitching against another client and lawyer, whereas the Melca approach was a collaborative approach, and we were told that we'd be able to make decisions together with the support of our lawyers in the same room, and that really appealed to us.
What resonated with me was putting children first and keeping children out of court. That's the most important thing. And the process of looking at the children's needs first, and then everything else fell into place after that.
The essential value behind Melca's approach is to transform the way families experience separation, to move it away from adversarial thinking, to move it away from the concept that there are legal answers to what's going on in your family. It's to look at separation as primarily an emotional crisis with financial and legal consequences, rather than seeing it as a legal crisis or a legal issue in the beginning.
When people think alternate dispute resolution, they think mediation. It's the go-to phrase, if you like. People then often don't know about collaboration, and they certainly don't know about what Melca does with a collaboration.
So you have collaboratively trained lawyers, a collaboratively trained financial neutral, and a collaboratively trained psychologist/communication coach.
The financial advisor has a few different roles, and the simplest role is collecting all the financial data, and I'll do that from a neutral and mutual place. So it's often the first place in family law land where the fight starts, where somebody feels like the other person hasn't provided information or is hiding something. Collecting that information from a neutral and mutual place feels really different if I ask somebody, oh, is there another bank account? Or, you know, they had thought we had more money in super. Can you help explain why that's not the case, rather than them feeling attacked?
I take a number of different roles within a collaboration. One of the roles is the communications coach, which is a neutral role. There are two neutrals in every team. One is the financial planner and one is the social scientist.
It's extremely positive experience as well. It's not seen as he said, she said. It's all that's taken away. Doesn't matter anymore, because, you know, you've come to the conclusion that your marriage is over. So that kind of stuff doesn't matter. You just leave that to the wayside and you think about, okay, what's my children's needs and how can we move forward to make their experience less traumatic?
They met with a child psychologist who had worked through the family court system, and she met with them and asked them, you know, what they thought was fair in terms of living arrangements. And not that teenagers talk much, and certainly when they're under stress and grief, they're not going to talk much. But it was a situation where they felt they were included, and hopefully they felt empowered.
So the people who work in the team are encompassing the family and caring about all the different aspects of the family's problems, but doing it in a way that's the way we think it needs to be dealt with. So the way we speak with each other, the way we behave towards each other is respectful. It's always polite. It's always considered. And that actually becomes contagious. You see people almost going to start and then they change the way they say something at the table. because they realise that at this table we don't do that.
And when you focus on common ground rather than difference, it really helps people come to a settlement and come to one that everyone can live comfortably with.
My role is to be a lawyer playing a very different role from a traditional role. I'm there to support my client, to help them to advocate for themselves. And what that means in collaboration is really to bring the best of themselves to the negotiation.
Collaborative law is the ideal, where people are positioning themselves in a completely different manner. They're creating a different frame from the very outset. They're thinking about solutions from the very outset, and everyone involved in that process is thinking about this particular matter from such a different perspective.
The other thing that I think collaborative law really does do is it removes the threat of litigation, so which is often in people's minds when they're negotiating otherwise, that if we don't reach agreement, well, I'll start proceedings, and if I don't sort of get what I want or what I'm prepared to accept, then we'll be going to court. And collaborative law removes that completely, because that's not part of the agreement and not part of the picture. And I think that does focus people on what kind of agreements they need to reach together with the help of their lawyers and whoever else might be involved, rather than what one or the other wants.
Many people think that collaboration is only for those people who are really amicable, that want to sort things out nicely together. And yeah, we love those sorts of clients. In fact, they're probably the easiest clients for us. But where we do really great work is for clients who have a level of conflict, who think they have to fight things out, because they're the clients that we can help understand that there is a better way, that they don't need to be fighting with each other, they don't need that bulldog lawyer, that they can get to a really good result, one that works for them in a very different way.
I can't overstate the importance of all people in the family being okay at the end of their separation. For children, it's incredibly important that they're not traumatised by divorce. For the parents, it's incredibly important that they as individuals, from their own sense of well-being, relationship with their co-parent, with their extended families and the entire world, aren't traumatised by that conflict. I have a really passionate belief that we have some capacity to minimise intergenerational trauma here. And we do know that these things pass down from generation to generation. Harm done to children in separation and divorce is something that they will take into their future relationships and their future parenting.
I feel that I, as a person, have come out of it as best, come out of that separation the best person that I can be. I think that's helped with that, and I'm still friendly with my ex-partner, and we're still being the best parents that we can be.
My sons are doing really well, both academically and emotionally. They are very open to being with me and my new partner, and also my new partner and my ex-husband have met, and we've all been in the house at the same time, having a cup of tea together at the kitchen table. So those things are kind of, you can do them.
I'm sorry that collaborative law wasn't around when I was still in practice, because I think I would really have enjoyed it. But I think it does give people the opportunity to resolve their dispute in a really good way, maintaining the relationships. And I think just the way it operates also enables people to learn those skills that they'll continue to need to resolve disputes that might arise in the future for them after they've resolved the initial dispute.
The goal is harm minimisation, trying to do as little harm as possible so that people can repair. Separation and family breakdown are huge stress, and a source of great worry and trauma for people. You want that to be resolved as quickly as possible. You want people to move to the next bit, to allow themselves to psychologically heal and repair. but to not understate the enormity of the impact that this is having on people's lives.
What we sometimes forget as judges is that we don't actually change people's nature or relationships when we decide cases. We kind of tend to think that we'll make orders and that we think are in the best interest of their children and that all will be well. Of course, all you do really for parties is you resolve their dispute. You don't change them as people. I think that the government actually ought to put a lot more money into what happens afterwards. We do put a lot of money into what happens before, but we don't pay much attention to what happens afterwards. The Law Reform Commission talked a little bit about that, but I think they really missed an opportunity to talk about parenting coordination.
I would like to see more resources at the front end, earlier intervention, greater cooperation, and I think also support for families at the other end once the process is resolved, for support for people so they're not just cut loose and let go.
If we thought of this as a health issue, a well-being issue, if we thought of it as an issue that would be dealt with some way within an administrative system, we'd have completely different conversations. If we thought about it being an issue that should be resolved by our wise elders or our spiritual leaders or whatever that person might represent for us culturally, we would be having entirely different conversations.
So if I was to have a magic wand, it would be in some ways to, cut out all of that and to go right back to basics and see if we could have all those issues dealt with by the one group of people that wasn't dominated by the courts, but was dominated by all the people who are involved with families in that area.
The truest, most helpful advice I can give to anyone who's going through separation is to choose your advisors carefully. The first professional you see who's involved in dispute resolution, lawyer, financial planner, psychologist, is going to have a powerful effect on the process that you end up stepping your way through. So don't match yourself with somebody who doesn't match your values.
It's important, if you've got any concerns whatsoever about some advice that you're given, get another opinion. Speak to someone else.
There are many, many organisations who provide ADR and mediation in particular. So seek mediation. If you need a lawyer, try to find a lawyer who's experienced in family law and who's going to help you resolve the matter. So try to find somebody who's going to be a resolver, not necessarily a litigator in the first instance.
The tricky thing is to match the right family with the right service provider, an approach that suits them. And sometimes we can get very competitive and very possessive about what we do and what we offer and why and how we're the best thing. But really, I think we're all different. We all have our own strengths and we all have something special to offer, and it's a matter of connecting with the right people at the right time so that we can do that. And there is space for us all.
If you can work it out yourselves, great. But if you need a little bit of help, then use an organisation that makes the process transparent and that you don't feel like you're fighting against each other, rather that you're working with each other for the best outcome.
Divorce is a marathon. It is not a sprint. It's going to take a little while for you to reframe the relationship, to reorganize your life, as it was. So be patient. Look for the positives in the relationship and focus on the positives so that you can move away from blaming, and also make sure that you focus on the children.
Well, I just think there's a continuing importance in trying to get things get a system that's as good as it can be for the benefit of children, because in the end, that's what's really important to society. And I've seen too much of parents really making a mess of their children's lives. And I think if we can avoid that, we should all be trying to do that.
Imagine what it would be like to have to make a decision about the two most important people in your life. A 9-year-old girl once said to me, "My mum and dad don't get it. I'm half my mum and I'm half my dad, and when they're in conflict, it feels like the two halves of who I am are in conflict, and I can't feel whole. For many of the children I see, that is their experience. They feel as though they're not integrated, that they're split and fragmented, that they have to split off parts of who they are themselves in the midst of this conflict, and they can't feel a sense of wholeness.
But it's important that parents realise that their children actually want, in their ideal world, both mum and both dad will love them and be there for them. And if they can enable that, then that's the greatest gift they can give their kids.